501 Cast. Information you need from experts we trust.
Okay, well, thank you and welcome to our next episode of 501 Cast, where we bring you information you need from experts that we trust. Today, we're going to be talking with Abby Donnelly from the Leadership and Legacy Group, and we're going to be talking about succession planning and the important role it takes in managing and directing and handing off leadership in for-profit and nonprofit corporations. So we're excited to talk with you today, Abby, and I would love to open up with you talking a little bit about your history and the Leadership and Legacy Group.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, Melissa. I'm so excited about this podcast, and I'm so excited about the work that you and your organization are doing. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I've started the Leadership and Legacy Group about 9 years ago, and I've been doing this work, though, for far longer than that. So what we do is we work with primarily business owners, although I do some nonprofit leadership succession planning. In fact, I have a meeting later this week to talk about that with a nonprofit. So we work with leaders to help them develop their leaders for succession so that they can take over and run the organization, in a business owner's case, profitably and sustainably. In a nonprofit situation, it would be sustaining and growing the organization after the leader exits. So we also work with folks that are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, et cetera, to help them figure out what that meaningful and rewarding next chapter is. So they have something to go towards as they exit their career in their nonprofit or business work.
Yeah. So yeah, we hear a lot of people who just think fondly of retirement and everything that's going to mean to them. But then you hear they become a retirement failure because there just isn't enough to engage them. And they're used to going from a very busy life to now figuring out what you do with all the spare time. And there's only so much golf you can play, right?
Exactly right. That is exactly right. And I think for executive directors of nonprofits, it's the same kind of a situation as with business owners, where they poured their life into this mission and this work, and leaving the position doesn't mean that their interest in that topic or in other topics is over, but they want to do it differently and they want to find something meaningful and rewarding. So they've got to figure that out.
Yeah, so not only helping them work through the business plan of succession planning, but also the emotional aspect of it.
That's exactly right. And it's very emotional. It's hard to walk away from a career that's been so meaningful and rewarding. It's, in a lot of cases, it's like the leader's, other child. It's been that important to them.
And it's taken up that much time in their life. Our work, we probably spend more time working, many of us, than we do at home and in our private lives. So it's important to know what that next step is and to be just as successful in retirement as we are in our work life. So it's great that you have this service and can help direct people in that manner. That's wonderful. So as we look at, what the statistics say is that less than 30% of nonprofit organizations have a succession plan in place. And I think we are speaking that it's relatively similar in the for-profit sector.
Yeah, it's something that's very easy to put off, unless we're thinking about an exit as imminent. And most of us are not, because, we enjoy what we're doing and we're getting good results. We're not thinking about succession. And so the idea of having to step back and figure out what is that plan going to look like? And it's a lot of work for people when they're not only not necessarily ready, but there's a zillion other priorities that are demanding our attention every day. And so this is long-term thinking, hopefully, instead of emergency planning. And long-term thinking is something, unfortunately, that many people just don't take the time to really put focus against.
Yeah, a lot of times those succession plans don't get written until months before the person's ready to go instead of years. So it's always better to plan ahead and also to identify the people that need to take a part in the role. So as you get started in helping an organization with succession planning, who's usually included in that?
Well, I think it's a little bit different in a nonprofit than in a for-profit. I think in a nonprofit, it's got to be certainly the leader of the organization, whether that's a president or executive director or CEO title, because they're really going to have the best look at what the organization is going to need based on the strategic plan. In a lot of cases, I think depending on the level that you're succession planning for, because we often think about succession planning as only really the top level or that top leadership team level, but I'm of the mind that you should be really succession planning bench strength all the way through the organization.
Yeah.
But if we think about the leadership team level, certainly the CEO, if we're succession planning for the CEO, the board needs to be an active part of that discussion. And in many cases, they're responsible for making that decision and finding that right successor. And then I think a lot of organizations benefit by having the board involved in some leadership team, the C-suite level, if you will, succession as well, because they may be serving on committees, they may know directionally where the strategic plan is going to be taking the organization. And so building in their input is important. And then within the organization, I believe that there's value in having the C-suite folks involved in discussions about succession, if not planning, at some level for their own. I think it's a reasonable question to ask all the time, like, who would be the best person to replace me if I were to leave tomorrow?
Right. And I think we found this last year too. Sometimes succession planning hits you all of a sudden because things happen that you can't plan for. So, getting started, even having a start is better than not having put pen to paper at all.
Melissa, I think you made a really interesting point, because one of the things that's also happening as a result of the pandemic over the last year is that the labor market, there are so many positions that are available and so many fewer people to fill them, that if you've got some, high potential, high caliber employees, retention has never been so important as it is today. Yeah. And if you want to attract some really strong talent to your organization, this is an opportunity to figure out what you really want and go after that talent, because people are looking. I read recently a statistic that said that close to 50% of all employees are looking. That's just mind-boggling, as compared to in 2019, I think it was somewhere around 18% or something like that. So market's changed.
People are really thinking about priorities and what their work-life balance is, and also what the work looks like. So a lot of that is talking about the ability to work remotely, to have some flexibility in your work schedule. And I think what we found this last year is people can work in different manners than we're used to and still be as productive. So I think, not only succession planning, but just even thinking about the work environment for all of your employees and how to be flexible in that, to help with retention and engagement of our current team, because turnover, we know, is so expensive. So when you start a succession plan, I think you have a process, or the Donnelly method, I think, that you've come up with for just planning out the steps for succession planning. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the Donnelly method is really, it sounds like a simple process. It's simple, but it's not easy to do. And the idea is that you've got to start with a strategic plan. So as you're thinking about succession, your strategic plan is really the first piece that I think needs to be in place, because the successor needs to be that's capable of leading that strategic plan. And if they're not, then either you have to change the successor or you have to develop a new strategic plan. And so we start with the strategic plan, and then we look at all of the ways to intentionally develop our leaders. There's a mindset out there that the best way to develop somebody is either through formal training or coaching or some sort of a formal, workshops or something like that, or it's by dragging someone along to watch you do what you do. But really, there are many, many wonderful ways of developing people that don't have to cost a lot of money and can be highly effective. And if anyone's interested, my website has a download that's free and doesn't require any information on 30 ideas that you can kind of build upon to develop your people. And so you've got to start with what are the skills and characteristics that you want for that successor role. But then once you have that, it's about figuring out how do you get that person prepared and ready so that they can do that work. And then we also like to look at what are the important systems and processes that need to be in place, because that's an important part of succession as well. As the more in place you have those systems so that they run routinely, the easier it is to hold people accountable and to be efficient. And then the last piece of the Donnelly method is about exiting well, moving on to that next chapter. So
I know in nonprofit management, founder syndrome is one of the things that a lot of nonprofits really have to be cognizant of, and be intentional about that plan for the founders who have put everything into developing and starting these nonprofits that's just so close to their heart, and to be able to respectfully but intentionally help them move into more of a support role and not as much of a leadership role to to help with the sustainability of organizations and their leadership. So I think, like you said, the emotions of this whole process too are always going to be there. And I think we talk about difficult conversations that sometimes have to be had. So what are some of the difficult conversations that are generally a part of this process?
Well, there are a number of difficult conversations that need to be had that you would have in a business situation that you might not have in a nonprofit, with family members that are in the business with you and some of those dynamics. But in any organization, certainly in a nonprofit, this is true. Sometimes the difficult conversations are around telling somebody that has been in a leadership role in the organization that they're not the right candidate to take over as the successor. They may have fantastic skills at level, but they're not going to be the right next executive director or president of the organization. Those can be difficult. Other difficult conversations might be the timeline for that executive director or leader to leave the organization. Sometimes we need to let people know sooner than we might want to. And they're hard to have because you want to keep the motivation of the organization moving forward. You don't want to show up as a lame duck, like I'm leaving, but I'm still going to be here for 9 more months.
Right.
And so figuring out what's the right timing to have those conversations. Same thing for an executive director that's got to have a difficult conversation with their board and let them know if they're going to be leaving, and weigh in on who they think the right next candidate should be, or what they think needs to change in order for the organization to be sustainable moving forward. So those are some pretty common difficult conversations. And then in any organization, depending on the nuances of the leaders and the challenges that the organization faces or the goals that they have, there may be other unique difficult conversations that could be had.
Yeah. And when we're doing this process, how far out does communication reach as you're working through a succession plan? How soon do you let support teams know what you're working on, and how do you include people so that they also have a comfort level, maybe with the direction and what's coming next as far as leadership?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. I mean, it's a great question, and I wish I could give you kind of a pat answer, but it really depends. And it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on, the culture in the organization. It depends on whether the successor is coming from within or will be someone that they're doing a national search for, or a broader search. Doesn't have to be national. It depends on the dynamics between the exiting leader and the board and the leadership team. Mm-hmm. So, and then it depends on the visibility in the community, because if word gets out before the community is prepared and the organization is prepared, that can be a real negative. So there's a lot of it depends. And part of what I think is important for any of us to do as we're working through that, certainly I'm doing that if I'm working with a leader, is figuring out what's the right timeline and process for their particular unique situation.
Yeah, and you said every organization, for profit, not for profit, everyone is different. Their cultures are different. the number of team members that they have that might be incorporated into the process are very different. So I think the big thing probably is just making sure that you are intentional about planning out that process and making sure that trust is kept through the whole process as well.
Well,
So,
you mentioned trust, and you're absolutely right. That is so important. And that's where it gets really tricky, is that, a trusted leader has typically been very transparent about things that they can be transparent about. And in some cases, this is something there can't be transparent about until the time is right. And so sometimes you run the risk in an organization that deeper in, even the leadership team is caught a little bit by surprise about finding out about it. But in many cases, the exiting leader has been as transparent as they can be at that time in order to preserve the integrity of the process.
yeah. Yeah, I'd love to go back a little bit when you were talking about developing people within the organization and opportunities early in the process to figure out, who do you have in your current talent pool, and then figuring out how to determine, which ones, and I believe that you have a chart where they can help figure out, those people who are giving their best performance in their current role and are open to being developed into higher roles. And then can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great point. There's a tool that I learned about actually after I wrote my book. I wish I had known about it before I'd written my book, because it would have been in there as is. There's a similar tool, but frankly, the 9-box is a better tool. Yeah. The 9-box is a tool. It's a really simple tool to use, and I think it's a great vehicle to get a leadership team involved in thinking about succession, or a board involved in thinking about succession. And what it does is it looks on one axis, it looks at what is a person's potential. And then the other axis looks at what is their performance. And so you've got high potential, medium potential, low potential. And then you've got high performance, medium, and low performance. And what you're really looking at is who are the people that are going to be high potential and high performers. They're already doing well and they have so much more potential to grow. And you want to really invest in them because there's so much opportunity for the organization and for them to continue to grow. And then in the opposite corner, you've got low potential and low performance. And the natural question that should come to mind when leaders are looking at this is, why are they still here? Because if they're not performing today and they don't have future potential, then they're probably not a fit in the organization. And then the other sections are sort of one axis or the other, where you've got some folks, no doubt, who are high performers, but they don't have growth potential. And so you want to keep those folks super happy in the role that they're in, because they're really important to the business. And many of them don't want to take on more responsibility and grow. And then you've got the other axis extreme, which is they've got phenomenal potential, but they're not doing well right now. And the question any leader should be asking is, why not? Yeah. Most likely they're in a role that's not a great fit for them, or they're being underdeveloped in that role. Like there's a training gap or something like that. And so figuring out how to fix that puts them on a glide path to be a really strong performer and with great growth potential.
And so what I think I have heard you talk about giving like stretch assignments. So talk a little bit about that. Sometimes it's difficult for leaders to understand how to develop people. We still need them to do the role they're doing. But how do we help to develop them as well, to expand their knowledge base and get them eventually to the next level without losing sight of the job that they're there to do to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great point, Melissa. I mean, they're in full-time jobs, but right, as they grow and as they look at potential for more growth opportunity down the road, I think stretch assignments can be really powerful. It's easier to do a stretch assignment when you have a large company or a large organization, because there's more there's more stretch to be done and more work to be done. But you can even find stretch assignments in a microcosm in a smaller organization. A stretch assignment in a large organization might look like you give somebody a 3-month project or a 1-year project or something like that, or you put them into a role that's only intended to last for some period of time. It's got clear deliverables, but the intent is that they get experience working in a very different way or with different people or on a different type of project opportunity. So for example, in a client that I've been working with, one of the stretch roles that they put somebody in was they had all operational experience, but if they were going to be prepared to take over in either like a development role or a sales role or something like that, they would need to learn that side of the business. And so they put them in a role where they would have to sell for some period of time. And it wasn't intended to be long-term, but it was intended to give them some exposure to that and some expectations. If you're in a smaller organization, you might give somebody a project, work with a project team they haven't worked with before, work on a project that takes them outside of their traditional, historical path. So things like that would be really valuable. And then, of course, support their development in that process, coach them, help them learn what they need to learn, reflect upon what they're doing and experiencing.
So Abby, we've been talking about a lot of things that we need to do during the succession planning process. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen people make when they've been doing this process or not doing it? Maybe that's one of the biggest mistakes, right?
That's exactly right. That's such a great lead in. That's exactly what it is that they're not doing it. I mean, the statistics that you shared were shocking, but they're true.
Yeah.
30% of nonprofit executives don't have a succession plan. So 70% do not, right?
Right.
And that's a pretty massive number because every leader is going to leave their organization one day.
Right.
And so, my philosophy is always be thinking about that development process for succession, because, hopefully we're leaving on our own terms on a timeline that works for us, but it's not always the case. And if you have a really strong bench, then the organization will sustain through an owner's departure or a leader's departure. So yes, I think that is the biggest one is, and so I was going to say not starting early enough, but yours is better than that. So, not doing one at all.
Yeah.
I think one of the other factors that shows up a lot is the selection process for the, I think about succession first in terms of who's going to be the successor for the executive director, the president of the organization when they leave. And I think the selection process is really important. There's a tendency to go with either a standard role, like there's a career path that leads to that, or there's a tendency to go with the person that you like the most, or you feel like is going to be the most accepted by the employees. And there is a role for all of that. It is an important criteria, but it's often not the criteria. It shouldn't be the criteria. So I think some of the things that need to be taken into account are, what are the skills and competencies that the new role under a new leader need to incorporate or need to have? And looking for somebody that has those skills or can develop those skills over the next couple of years. I think a broad-based experience set that can be utilized successfully in that new role is important. Someone that's got demonstrated results. So we talked about the 9 box,
Right.
and it's not only someone with high potential, but somebody that has already demonstrated their ability to perform.
Mhm.
And so results matter. I think the culture of the organization, maintaining that continuity through, so somebody that can drive that. And then, we talked earlier about the importance of knowing what the strategic plan is.
Yeah.
So somebody that's going to have the skills, not just to do today's role, but the role of the future.
Right.
So those are, I think, some important ways of finding the right selection. And then the other thing I was going to mention around mistakes is, you talked about it earlier, and I think it's such a great point, is the need to be really intentional about development. So, creating a plan to develop your leaders. and develop multiple leaders, because, instead of saying, well, I'm going to develop this person for this role, why not do intentional development across the organization? Because you build a better team, you build a better, stronger organization. And no matter who it is that ultimately moves into that top leadership role, you have a stronger, better team. Like, who could argue with that?
Yeah, and it adds to the culture that you are a culture of growth and learning and development, and who wouldn't want to be a part of that, right?
Exactly.
So we've talked a lot about the plan, but so how do you get started? So if you haven't done anything yet, and you're having a lot of aha moments as you're watching this, how do you get started? What's the first step?
Yeah, I think the first step is taking a look at what's the strategic plan, and what are the things that will be important in the next leader.
Okay.
So identifying what some of those skills and competencies are, what results are going to need to be demonstrated, and starting to put together a profile of who that right next leader is. And ideally, as you put that profile together, you've got some people within the organization that bubble to the surface, because that kind of a transition, I think in a nonprofit organization and a for-profit, can be really healthy and valuable for the organization and for the leaders in it. So if you've got somebody that might bubble up, then it's starting to explore, are they a possibility, and what would it take to develop them? And you don't necessarily have to have that conversation with them quite yet, but I think starting to put them, challenge them, put them into some role experiences, or give them some intentional development that enables you to see them in different situations and scenarios, and understand if they've got both the interest and the motivation, as well as the potential to be able to grow into that. I think that's a good way to get started.
I think there's a habit of people to see people in certain positions, and they see, that they're good at that they excel in maybe in that area. And it's hard for you to see them in other roles sometimes, unless you really put them in those roles and really see what develops. And on the opposite, there's times people aspire to be in a certain role and they think it's exactly what they want. And if they have a little time to explore it and try it out, maybe find that it's really not what they think their next role will be. So it really is something that helps on both sides too, to discern, what are their strengths and what are their goals, and what areas do they want to move to and grow to. So definitely something that helps everyone in the process.
Very well said.
Yeah, so this has been a wonderful time talking with you and learning about succession planning. Is there anything that you'd like to add that you haven't said yet about this topic, or share about your book that you have?
Well, I'm happy to share about my book. It's called Straight Talk About Planning Your Succession, and it's a primer for CEOs. And it's a pretty easy read. It's about 100 pages. And, most people that read it say it was easy. And my hope would be that anyone reading it would get a few nuggets from it. I think the only other closing comment I would make is that I think that the most important piece of this process is the theme that you brought up at the very beginning, which is get started thinking about it. Even if it's only your own thinking, it's about getting started and developing your people in the process, because you'll never go wrong doing that.
Right. Well, I totally agree with you there. So this has been a wonderful, wonderful time with you. Look forward to maybe talking with you about some other topics.
I love that, Melissa. You're a fantastic interviewer. So
well,
thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. It's been fun talking with you. And we'll get some more information at the end about Abby's book and where to find that, and her website, in case you have additional questions that you'd like to reach out to Abby to. But she's been a great resource for me for the last few years. And I hope you found, like she said, a couple nuggets in this 501 cast that'll be helpful for you as you look into succession planning. If you haven't started, please get started. So you all have a good day.